this morning. I see Kathy remembered to record it. All right, so I'm going to talk about a lot of different things here this morning as it relates to climate change in your woodlot, and basically looking at the question, can my woodlot be a solution to climate change? Well, we're going to look at many different things about that this morning, okay? Now, when we start looking at all the aspects of forests, right? When we start looking at forests and climate change, carbon is the main component that we look at in forests as it relates to climate change. And we look at the carbon cycle. And if you look at this drawing of the carbon cycle, you can see it's pretty complex. There's a lot of different inputs, outputs to the system. But when we start looking at the forest related portion of that, it's the carbon cycle becomes very important, okay? Because forests, as you all know, are made up of living and dead plants, biological organisms, okay? And all of that obviously contains lots of carbon. So looking at forests more specifically, we find there's a lot of back and forth exchange of carbon with the atmosphere due to live and dead vegetation that we see in forests. And also because of fire, harvesting of wood from the forest, so forth, et cetera. So there's a lot of give and take when it comes to carbon in forests. So when we begin to consider the role forests can play in climate change mitigation, then all of these factors, that's in the give and take of carbon in these forests becomes very important components to consider. So let me just look at some basics here of the carbon cycle in forests. Carbon comes or is absorbed into the forest system primarily in the form of carbon dioxide. So if we look at the absorption side of things in forests, when it looking at carbon, trees store carbon for long periods as they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the primary mechanism by which a lot of the carbon gets captured into the forest ecosystem, right? And roots of living trees transfer carbon to the forest soil. And through the transfer of carbon, enriched compounds from the roots to soil microbes, right? And then forest soils also absorb carbon from dead trees, from branches and leaves and so forth, laying on the forest floor through decomposition. Now, photosynthesis is the primary mechanism by which carbon enters the forest ecosystem. The carbon that gets captured in the forest gets released back into the atmosphere through a variety of means, right? When we're looking at the release side, trees, plants respire, right? That's sort of, the photosynthesis makes the food for the trees. The trees, in essence, it's a consumption, it's food. They make the carbohydrates where the carbon is captured into that molecule, but then they respire as a result of that. And so therefore, respiration releases carbon back in the atmosphere. And then there is tree and plant decomposition, fires in forests, whether we're talking about, of course, wildfires or controlled fires, they release carbon back out into the atmosphere. The decomposition of organic matter in the soil, and even logging and manufacturing activities related to the production of a variety of different forest products, okay? So I'm gonna speak to forest products a little later here in the presentation this morning, but I will point out here as we look at this give and take of carbon and forest, lumber and other products that are made from trees still contain the carbon that they absorb, right? The carbon is tied up in the plant cell walls and the cell walls of the trees, of the wood. And so that carbon remains there for long periods of time until the product is either burned or the product decays. As I proceed in talking about some things here this morning, there's some definitions I need to go through, okay? We'll be using terms like carbon sequestration. And that, when we talk about that, that's the process of capturing and storing the atmospheric carbon dioxide. When we talk about carbon stocks, okay, that's the quantity of carbon that's contained or stored in a pool, right? Meaning a reservoir system which has the capacity to accumulate or release carbon, right? In this diagram down here, I've highlighted, several important pools of where carbon is stored in forest ecosystems, certainly in the above ground live trees, in the understory, and even in the dead standing trees. Carbon is still tied up into the particularly the wood component of these trees, and certainly any of the dead wood that's out on the forest floor. We look at the forest floor material, or often we refer to as litter, which is often composed of, leaves that have fallen off, small branches, so forth, et cetera. And then down here in the soil, right, there's carbon that's in the soil, and then certainly in the root systems, okay? So when we talk about the amount of carbon or carbon stocks that are in forests, this carbon is going to be stored in these different reservoirs or pools, okay? And then we talk about carbon sinks, and a carbon sink is anything that absorbs more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than it releases, all right? So it's sort of more of a net consumption of carbon into the system. And then when we talk about carbon flux, that's the annual change in carbon stocks as a result of this give and take, right? I've already mentioned, forests absorb carbon, but they also will release carbon. So when we talk about that dynamic of absorption and release, that's what we refer to as this carbon flux that occurs in these systems. So we can assume then that the more live biomass in a system, the more carbon stocks that are contained in the system, okay? Because carbon is bound in plant material. And so in fact, the amount of carbon stocks is directly related to the amount of live biomass that is present. So this map displays where the greatest amount of carbon stocks based on live biomass reside in the United States, right? Carbon is a major constituent of cell walls, and therefore more biomass equals more carbon. And when we think about the deadwood component of forests, until deadwood has totally decayed to, in essence, nothing, it still contains carbon. Now, granted, as it decays, and the cell walls break down, it's releasing carbon. But until that happens, that carbon is still stored in that deadwood material. Okay, so until these walls are broken down through decay and released in the atmosphere and the soil, it still sits there. And so this shows us where a lot of in terms of the deadwood pools of our carbon stocks, this is where the different amounts reside here in the United States. All right, and certainly you can see in certain areas there's a higher component of the deadwood pool that we see here than in other parts of the U.S. And we can't obviously forget about the soil. Soil contains high amounts of carbon, and in fact, in some ecosystems, including some forest types, it's going to be the dominant carbon containing component of the ecosystem. And you'll see that in just a little bit here. Okay, carbon enters the soil through decomposition of plant material, through roots of plants, and through symbiotic relationships of microorganisms in the soil. Now, soil disturbances tend to release carbon out of the soil. And so since many forests basically remain essentially undisturbed for periods of time, it allows for the buildup of carbon in the soil. So if we look then at the total forest carbon stocks in the US, it shows an increasing amount of stored carbon nationally. Now, if we look at comparing the amount of increase of this total carbon stock, and that when I'm saying total carbon stock, I'm including all pools, all reservoirs, soil, deadwood, so forth, et cetera. If we compare the amount of increase over the past 3-decade periods, the periods of from 2000 to 2010 and 2010 to 2019 show less of an increase in the total carbon stock pools compared to what was gained from 1990 to 2000. But if we take a look at this change by carbon pool, okay, if we look at this, the above ground biomass was the greatest contributor to the increase in carbon stocks over this amount of time in terms of the amount of tonnage of carbon. The soil carbon pool, which by far has the greatest amount of carbon stock, saw very little change over this period of time. In fact, the greatest increase were found in the above and below ground biomass and the amount of deadwood in these forests, and looking at the breakout of these carbon stocks by the carbon pools. As you can see, there's very little change in the soil carbon stocks between 1990 and 2000, all right? And then, or 2019, right? There's very little change. But again, that is partially because of, very little disturbance that we see in many of these forest soils, all right? And if we look at the soil organic material, it was the soil organic pool and the litter pool were the only ones that showed any bit of a decrease over that period of time from 1990 to 2019. So they've been relatively stable. Now, if we take a look at Ohio, Ohio likewise saw an increase in the forest carbon stocks from 1990 to 2020. The total forest carbon stocks increased about 11.6%, or a gain of about 63 million metric tons over this period of time. And again, this also includes the mineral and organic soil carbon. And if we take a look at this, how it breaks down by carbon pools, it's somewhat similar to what we see at the national level. The greatest increases were a result of increases in the above ground and below ground biomass, as well as the deadwood component. Now that's a little interesting when we look at where the greatest gains in the carbon stock pools occurred. And here we see, while from a absolute amount, looking at a gain from 1990 to 2020 in the deadwood component of a little over 19 million metric tons of carbon, that still represented a 231 or almost a 232% change from 1990 to 2020, right? So it's indicating that obviously that the amount of deadwood accumulation was high during this period of time from 1990 to 2020. So when we start thinking about this carbon flux, right, and that's important to understand that when we're thinking about, how much carbon our forests are actually netting out of the atmosphere, we have to look at what the different components are. When we start looking at the inputs or the sink, all right, forest growth, right? That becomes very important. Faster growing trees sequester carbon at faster rates. And the more volume a tree has, the more weight of carbon that is stored in that tree. Species composition. Now I'll show you here after this slide, show you how that really can make a difference. Species with higher wood density will contain more carbon than species with lower wood density, all right? That's going to be an influence. And obviously management. When we're looking at the management of forest, that certainly will influence the forest growth and species composition, which is what I highlighted there in points 1 and 2. And then forest age. Younger forests grow faster, thereby sequestering carbon faster. However, old forests contain larger volumes, thereby containing more stored carbon. All right, so those are important to think about when we're looking at the different aspects of terms of the inputs into our total forest carbon pools. Now, when we start looking at the outputs, where the sinks are, or the source, or not the sinks, but the source is in these forests, we look at respiration, right? I already mentioned that. In the process of using the carbohydrates or the food made in the photosynthesis, plant respires, causing about half of carbon to be released, all right? And then we also get respiration out of the soil. Soil respiration of microbes also causes release of carbon. And then we've talked about the dead wood, right? Mortality, decay. Decay causes the breakdown and slow release of stored carbon in many of the plant cell walls. And then certainly when fire occurs in forest, fire causes a rapid release of stored carbon. We start getting this process of pyrolysis that breaks down a lot of the plant cells and so forth, and we get a lot of carbon released as a result of fire. And then there's harvesting. Removing trees removes carbon, the stored carbon, out of the forest. However, as I pointed out, this carbon still remains sequestered until the wood is burned or decays, thereby releasing eventually, at that point in time, the stored carbon. All right. So all of these are part of this whole forest ecosystem, the carbon flux, when we start looking at how much carbon our forests are bringing in and keeping in, which is very important when we start thinking about how forests can help mitigate climate change, right? It's how much carbon not only how much carbon can it take in, but how much can it keep in that system, okay? I mentioned species composition. First of all, carbon on the average is 50% of the dry weight of plants, of trees. And that's usually consistent. We've done some studies with this in Ohio, and we found with different species that the wood content averages on the samples that we had was around 49.8%. So it's about 50%. And that also was true with foliage content when we looked at it. So that pretty much holds true. So for an example, I pulled out some species that we commonly find here in Ohio, and did a what if. What if we had these species, we scaled them out at 55 cubic feet of volume, right? And just looking at the wood component right now, looking at the wood, how much carbon would be contained in each one of these trees of these particular species if each one scaled at 55 cubic feet of volume? Well, if you look over on the right, the amount of carbon in terms of pounds, we see with tree species of the same volume, they're going to contain different amounts of carbon. Okay, so if we start looking at forest composition, and how much do we have of one species versus another and so forth, then that certainly is going to influence the amount of carbon stocks that sit in your forest. I mentioned forest age, okay? And forest ages will determine not only the amount of carbon stocks, but also the rate at which carbon is sequestered or absorbed out of the atmosphere. We studied the carbon stocks and sequestration rates of oak forests here in Ohio, and this graph shows what is going on in the above ground portion of multiple sized trees over time, right? This line here represents the total amount of carbon that is accumulating in those trees. The green line here indicates how quickly that carbon is being sequestered in that tree. And what we see here is that it peaks, the rate at which carbon is being brought in and sequestered into the tree occurs at a relatively young age, about 25 years of age for oak forests, okay? Now, even though they peak at an early age, we still see that the rate of sequestration, even though it has declined, these forests still continue to accumulate carbon over time, but at slower rates. But they still continue to contribute to the total carbon pool. Now, I just want to show that here in this slide is that this is not just a phenomena that we see with oak forests. It's something that we basically see in all forests, that the rate of sequestration occurs at relatively young ages. Now, at what age that is, that certainly is going to vary by species. It's going to vary by the quality of the site, but it's all going to occur at relatively young ages. The graph on the left shows running data through a loblolly pine model, shows that in loblolly pine forests that it peaks early, somewhere around 15 to 20 years of age in terms of sequestration rates. But again, you will see that the total carbon accumulation still continues and still adding total carbon to the pool. And if you look on the graph on the right, what you're looking at is Scotch pine forest. It's looking at everything in the above ground portion of these forests minus the soils, not looking at the soils. And we see here, even if we start thinking about everything else above the ground in terms of the total carbon accumulation, it's still the rate of accumulation peaks relatively early in the life of the forest. But again, that doesn't, they're still accumulating large amounts of carbon. Now, speaking of forest age, I just thought I would put here that showing what the age distribution of our forests here in Ohio. This is based on FIA data from 2018. One of the things is, as I pointed out, that age is a contributor to the carbon dynamics, again, with younger forests sequestering more carbon per year and older forests containing more carbon stocks. So if you look at where Ohio's forests stand regarding age, we find that 68% of Ohio's forests, and this is based on the amount of area they occupy, 68% are greater than 50 years of age, with the average age around 62 years. So what this means is that most of Ohio's forests have passed their peak sequestration rate, but they still continue to increase in the amount of carbon stocks. So let me just sort of summarize some of the things that we've just talked about here. All right. Young forests sequester more carbon due to faster growth, but do not store as much carbon as older forests. Older forests store more carbon than younger forests. Larger trees store more carbon than smaller trees, and the larger crown of these larger trees provides greater carbon absorption surfaces than small crowns. Larger root systems provide more opportunities for movement of carbon into the soil. Greater amounts of understory vegetation allow more absorption of carbon into the forest system, which is, something that we more commonly see in older forests. Decomposition of foliage on the forest floor places more carbon into the soil, but also releases carbon into the atmosphere. Decomposition of standing dead trees places more carbon into the atmosphere, except where tree fragments fall to the ground. When standing snags, the bark sloughs off and the material lays on the ground. Then the carbon gets placed into the soil and the atmosphere. And decomposition of fallen logs and twigs places carbon into the soil and atmosphere. And finally, fire releases carbon into the atmosphere and the soil. The amount of carbon that's released depends certainly on the fire intensity and the amount of fuel that is consumed. So, kind of that was sort of a breakdown, a quick go through of carbon dynamics in forests, just to understand sort of the connection of carbon and forests and so forth. So now we start looking at the question, how can my forest help mitigate climate change, right? Which is basically the crux of some of the things that we need to talk about this morning, all right? Well, first of all, on average, forests absorb twice as much carbon as they emit each year. And on average, forests absorb approximately 25% of all carbon emissions globally, when we think about it globally, and compared to 14% in the US overall, and then in Ohio, about 3%. And forests account for 92% of all terrestrial biomass globally, storing approximately 400 gigatons of carbon. But as you can see in this graph, that's not homogeneously distributed across the earth, right? So the amount of carbon that is sequestered and stored and the rate at which it's sequestered in a forest is going to depend on many factors. And we've already talked about some of those, but it's also going to depend upon additional factors such as climate, right? Warm versus cool climates, dry versus moist. And it's also going to be determined by latitude. This affects species composition, forest growth, length of growing seasons, and soil respiration. And so subsequent tree size is also a factor. Tropical forests are going to sequester and store more carbon than boreal forests. And regionally, it is also influenced by the amount of forest land, all right? If we start thinking about kind of a more regional basis, it's going to be influenced more by the amount of forest land that exists. Regions with more forest will contain more forest carbon than regions with fewer forests. Ohio is about 30% forested. So it will sequester, looking at it at a state level, it will sequester and store less carbon out of the atmosphere than, say, Pennsylvania, which is 58% forested, okay? So it does matter where your forest is. It matters how old your forest is. It also matters what the species composition is. So not all forests are created equal. And so thereby the carbon fluxes that we see in all of these different forest ecosystems are also not going to be equal. So regardless of Western US versus Eastern US, we find that forests are a major carbon pool in both regions. Forests can contribute significantly to the capture and storage of atmospheric carbon. We just need to recognize that forests are biological systems that display many different carbon fluxes and are influenced by many internal and external forces, natural and human caused. So if you take a look at this particular diagram here, we find that forests, whether we talk about the East or the West, forests are a major carbon pool compared to other different types of ecosystems that we might consider across the landscape, okay? So forests are important, all right? So forests then act as a huge sponge, right, that absorbs carbon out of the atmosphere, all right? Think of it sort of like that. And since forests act as carbon sinks, that is, they absorb more than they emit, absorbing roughly more than 2.2 billion tons of carbon dioxide globally each year, they provide one of the most cost-effective forms of climate change mitigation, right? You know, in looking at trying to mitigate climate change, what we're trying to reduce the amount of carbon, in particular carbon dioxide, that's in the atmosphere. And certainly forests can play a significant role in trying to accomplish that. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recognized forests, you know, through sustainable management, reforestation, afforestation, or even in preservation. They recognize forests as a means to not only mitigate climate change, but also in the process, also to conserve and preserve biodiversity and provide the necessary ecosystem services to a growing population. So forests are important in many respects, all right? So in terms of the climate change mitigation, in order to encourage this sustainable management of forests, prevent forest loss, encourage planting of forests, and so forth, et cetera, there has been a system of what is referred to as offsets and credits that have been produced to help encourage the sustainable management of forests and to do all of these things: climate change mitigation, biodiversity preservation, so forth, et cetera. All right, so now we'll kind of walk through some of this. So when we're talking about a carbon offset, and this is going to be something that we will be talking about in terms as it relates to forests and managing forests and for climate change. A carbon offset is a reduction in emissions of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases that is made in order to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. So, for example, you know, we have an emitter, whatever that might be, over here. And so let's say it emits 1 ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, all right? Well, over here we have, let's say, a forest that sequesters a ton of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Being able to measure both of these, that one that you have emitted a ton and now you have sequestered a ton, that in essence creates an offset. So in other words, for a ton of carbon dioxide that you've emitted into the atmosphere, over here you have, in essence, recaptured that ton of carbon dioxide. So you have offset that, all right? So that creates a carbon offset. So a carbon credit then is a tradable permit or certificate that provides the holder of the credit to the right to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent of another greenhouse gas. And it's essentially an offset for producers of greenhouse gases. So in other words, the offset that is created is standardized, registered, is made into a tradable certificate that eventually then has market value that somebody can purchase. Now, at the end of this presentation, I will let the economist and the policy folks, Dr. Sohngen and Mehmood, kind of address more of those questions, all right, about how these offsets are turned into credits, right? A credit can only be established when an offset has been produced. So in essence, that offset that you have produced, say in a forest, has to be established as a credit that therefore can be purchased by an emitter that can verify that they have an offset as a result, all right? So carbon credits, carbon offsets become very important, all right? So what some of you may be thinking about, like, so what, right? So how does this benefit me in my woodlot? That might be one of the questions that you are asking yourself right now. And if it's not, I will ask it for you, right? Okay, so now what, right? Well, one thing you can do really is to do nothing with your woodlot, sit back and relax and feel good that your woodlot is sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and helping to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, right? We've already established forests do that naturally, right? That's one of the things that they do. Or you can become more proactive and increase the C-sink of your woodlot, the carbon sink of your woodlot, and possibly gain financial benefits in the process. So forest carbon through carbon credit offset markets provides an opportunity for landowners to be compensated for making long-term commitments to storing carbon on their lands, okay? Your forest is actually producing a product that maybe you didn't realize that you had in your woodlot, okay? Carbon offsets can be turned into carbon credits that are bought and sold on carbon markets. All right, well, let's kind of go through this. All right, now I'm not going to go through all the details of the differences here, but when we start looking at carbon markets, all right, there is what is referred to as voluntary markets, and then there are compliance markets. And one of the main differences is that compliance markets are more or less dictated by laws or regulations enacted that limit or cap the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions by a company, all right? And so this, the compliance markets, we get into these cap and trade programs. All right, and a lot of these markets are determined more by laws, by regulations. But when we look at voluntary markets, and this is probably going to be the market that most forest carbon projects would fall into, voluntary markets exist where companies or individuals buy carbon credits for purely a voluntary reason, all right? Many companies want to purchase carbon credits to demonstrate their commitment to protecting the environment, to demonstrate corporate social responsibility. You see a lot of companies talking about going carbon neutral by a certain period of time and so forth. They're not required by law to do any of that, like you might see in compliance markets where emitters are required by law to emit only certain amounts of carbon annually, et cetera. But the voluntary markets are a little bit more variable in their prices compared to compliance markets. The carbon market price in compliance markets is more stable. Markets are created by national, international treaties, such as the Kyoto Protocol and the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, so forth, et cetera. But the voluntary carbon market price is more variable, It's more market driven based on willingness to pay, supply, demand, so forth, etc. Now, one of the things that we see, however, in both markets is the trading unit. Right? The trading unit is 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, in just a few moments, I'll better define what that is when we talk about carbon dioxide equivalence, what that is. Okay, because one of the things that we see with greenhouse gases, while carbon dioxide is one of the primary culprits of greenhouse gas, it's not the only one, but it is. Everything is placed upon the same units to make it easier to do your trading and pricing and so forth. And the guidelines in terms of establishing offsets, credits, and so forth are going to be more flexible in the voluntary markets than they are in compliance markets. All right. Now I'll let the economists and the policy folks maybe better define that here at the end. Now, as I pointed out, most forest carbon projects enter the voluntary markets. All right. Participants in the voluntary markets include private investors, governments, non-governmental organizations, and businesses who wish to voluntarily purchase carbon offsets to offset their emissions, basically to reduce their carbon footprint. And so basically how that works is that, you have carbon offsets that are created in your forest, okay? A carbon registry, I'll talk about that in just a moment. A carbon registry turns the offsets into credits to be sold, all right? Then carbon credits are purchased by an emitter to offset those emissions. And thereby the landowner gets paid for the offsets or credits that are created, all right? That's somewhat simplified, okay? Just to sort of understand the concept, right? So when we talk about carbon projects, what are we talking about, right? What are some of the things? Well, some of the more common types of forest carbon projects, they fall into one of 3 categories. One is afforestation or reforestation. This is projects involving restoring tree cover to previously non-forested land, okay? So this would not apply, you clear cut your forest and replant it. No, that would not qualify. We're looking at land that was not previously forested, but now you go and establish a forest in an area where there was previously no forest. Another project would be what is referred to as avoided conversion. This is where you are, and you have to verify that you are going to prevent the conversion of forest land to non-forest land, right? Maybe your forest land is under pressure for development. We see that with farmland. A lot of farmland, particularly around urban areas, are getting pressured, because of higher land use value to sell it and to develop housing developments. Well, your woodlot may be in a similar position, right? But you are going to, rather than put it into another land use class, you're going to prevent it from being converted. Right? So project developers must demonstrate that the forested land is under significant threat of conversion. Right? You have to demonstrate, that forest, you're not going to sell that forest, you're not going to clear it for some other purpose, whatever. Okay. And then finally, in this 3rd category, this one I would say is somewhat of a gray area. And when it comes to registering these as projects, certainly it's not gray, but there's some flexibility in determining what defines improved forest management. projects that involve land management activities that increase or at a minimum maintain the current level of carbon stocking and so forth might be eligible. So when we talk about improved forest management, for example, and there's some flexibility with this. That might be some things such as increasing the overall age of the forest by increasing rotation ages. Maybe, you have a certain rotation age, that's fairly young, 40, 50 years, but you are going to now make it 100 years or whatever, okay? Increasing the forest productivity by thinning diseased or suppressed trees or managing brush or other competing vegetation. But one of the things that you, in doing all this, whether you improve your harvesting practices, whatever, if in looking at this would be sort of what you normally would do in your management of the forest in terms of what your carbon would be. But if you can demonstrate that through future improved management practices, you can actually increase the carbon pool that exists in your forest. That might be something that would increase the growth rates, reduce the amount of deadwood, so forth. Which eventually the deadwood, of course, releases carbon, et cetera. But the increase that you can demonstrate, that becomes an offset. Okay. Or for example, in the case of, if you were, simply extending rotations or whatever, right? There might be a certain level of your woodlot right now in terms of what is out there in the amount of carbon in tons per acre. You enroll your forest at this point in time, all right? So the amount of carbon in your forest at the time of enrollment becomes the baseline. You can't count the carbon that's already stored in the forest, but you can count the carbon that is added to this baseline value, all right, to become an offset. So how this is done specifically is going to vary from registry to registry, et cetera. But those are some of the general things that we are looking at in terms of improved forest management, okay? Now, when we're looking at what are some of the common things that we see, right? There's going to be certainly certain eligibility requirements to develop a forest carbon offset project on your land. And so what I have listed here are some commonalities among the different carbon registries. You can, for those of you who are familiar with forest land certification, you can sort of think of carbon registries something similar to that of forest certifying bodies, right? They have standards, things that you have to adhere to, et cetera. And that also is the case with many of these carbon registries. Now, in terms of these requirements, right? Additionality. When they use the term additionality, what that means is additionality requires that the forest project sequester more carbon than in a business as usual scenario, right? Projects must demonstrate that the carbon sequestration would not have happened without the development of the specific offset project. There are going to be certain requirements for permanence. And what we mean here is that permanence requires that the greenhouse gas removal enhancements be maintained for certain periods of time into the future. Basically, in some cases, landowners must be willing to forego harvesting for a period of years into the contract period into the future. There is concerns in projects about what is referred to as leakage, right? Leakage from carbon projects happens when greenhouse gas reductions in one area results in an unintended increase in greenhouse gas emissions in another locations, okay? So project managers, they've got to demonstrate that their project does not cause excessive leakage, essentially wiping out the increases in greenhouse gas removal from their project. I mean, I remember one time I visited a large carbon project that was funded by World Bank in South China. It was about 5,000 hectares, so that's almost 15,000 acres. They were selling the credits that were produced. They were selling them to companies in Italy and Spain. But one of the things, when I went to visit the site, I had to record, for example, the type of vehicle I was driving to the site, the mileage, the horsepower of the engine, so forth, et cetera, because I, as part of that project, my driving there to visit the project was a part of that project. So they had to count for leakage, okay? Because obviously the vehicle I was driving, and I will say was probably emitting a lot of carbon, the vehicle I was driving, but it was emitting carbon, and I was putting carbon in the atmosphere to go to this project. So, leakage becomes important because that obviously is an important component of the overall scheme here. Sometimes there are land minimums, right? There are often minimum number of acres to enroll. Some have a minimum, for example, of 40 acres of forest land, all right, that you need to have, all right? Forest density, some have minimums, something like 10% canopy cover, all right? Now, certainly that, how do you define canopy cover and so forth? Well, like I say, these are some generalities, but when you start looking at what requirements are, then you can get to what they specifically want in terms of, what those minimums are. And harvesting, commercial harvest on many of these must not have occurred on the property within a certain number of years prior to the enrollment date. All right. So those are some of the general requirements that we see in some of these, and every one of them has very specific things. So depending on the registry that you work with, you'll have to take a look at what those specificities are. All right. So there certainly are a variety of voluntary market registries. I've got some of them listed here. And so all of these certainly have, they all have common requirements, and then they all have specific requirements to that registry. There are a variety of forest carbon consultants that can work with you to establish a forest carbon offset project in your forest, who know the ins and outs of the registries and know what the requirements are, okay? And there's a lot of forest carbon consultants out there that can work with you, all right, to help you set this up. Now, in thinking about this, what are some things that need to be considered? Well, certainly there is the required commitment period. How long do I have to commit my woodlot to this project, right? There certainly are costs of developing a project and managing its obligations throughout the full project life. Okay, there's going to be costs associated with that. The other thing that you have to certainly think about, and possibly one of the reasons you would consider this is what you get paid, right? You have to think about offset volume and price trends and potential. You have to look at that, all right? Is it worth it, okay, for me to do this? You have to look at your past management practices and what you think your future forest management objectives are going to be, and what you want out of your forest versus what you are required in terms of these projects, right? How your short and long-term management objectives will be impacted by enrolling your land in a forest carbon project to ensure alignment, right? Is doing, rolling your forest in a carbon project, offset project, is it compatible with what you want out of your forest? So it's recommended that landowners work with carbon brokers or consultants to answer questions to get this set up. Many of them know what the measurement requirements are in terms of your forest, how to evaluate the methodology is to document the amount of carbon that is being accumulated in your forest on an annual basis, so forth, et cetera. And I encourage landowners to work with them because the markets and process sometimes is too complicated for the average landowner to establish for themselves. It can be a complicated thing. So those would be some of the things that you certainly should consider. Now, well, how many offsets? If you put the dollar sign on the offsets and subsequently the credits, right? How many offsets can be produced? Well, certainly the number of offsets will depend upon the methodology chosen, right? Now, different registries have different methods of quantifying the carbon, right? So, that's going to be one factor. What the specific management practices are that we are talking about, and certainly many other factors. In other words, it's hard to say, right, until you actually do it. But it's important to note a couple of things as you think about this. Timber stocks are not equal to carbon stocks. All right. Now, I've been talking about looking at forest growth and tree growth and how that sequestration rates and storage and so forth. But also think about your forest as a big pool. You got many pools out there, right? So since carbon stocks may also include deadwood, harvested timber, all these other carbon pools, just what you have out there in timber doesn't tell the whole story in terms of what you have out there in carbon. And carbon stocks are not equal to carbon offsets, since offsets are calculated as the difference between the project and a modeled baseline scenario of carbon stocks in the project's absence, okay? So the baseline definition and modeling differ from standard to standard and are a critical component of carbon offsets because the baseline establishes the reference condition against which the project activity is compared. Now, trying to find some of the most recent data, the voluntary market prices. Now, the voluntary market prices are somewhat volatile. It's based on the supply and demand of carbon credits. And as I mentioned already, and I'll mention again, Doctors Sohngen and Mehmood can better explain this. As well as the feasibility of developing carbon offset project. It becomes the bottom line as to how much I can get paid, for example, to not cut my trees, but rather get paid to keep my trees and to continue to sequester more carbon, right? So over the years, the situation on the voluntary carbon markets has been one of oversupply of credits. The average prices have dropped almost every year since 2008 from a high in 2008 of $7.30 per ton of CO2 equivalent to around $2.70 a ton in 2018, all right? So it's been somewhat decreasing in market value. Now, all right, so I've been mentioned the carbon dioxide equivalence, all right? So, and this is where trading and pricing is based on, and so it's important to understand what it is that we're talking about here. Carbon volume and prices on the market are traded and bought in units of carbon dioxide equivalence. right? And so this is done so that we have a common unit for all greenhouse gases, right? So this provides consistency in markets comparing apples with apples. Even though carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas of concern, it is not the only one. And not all offset projects, not just forestry, offset just carbon dioxide, but also offset other greenhouse gases. So therefore, all greenhouse gases are based on their global warming potential, with carbon dioxide the major contributor and potential. Okay, so if we take a look at what the global warming potential is of the various greenhouse gases. So if I look at, for example, we can determine, how many carbon dioxide equivalents we have by multiplying the amount of the greenhouse gas that we're talking about by its global warming potential, right? So, for example, if 1 ton of methane, CH4, okay, is emitted, that has the equivalent effect as emitting 25 tons of CO2. And basically, how do we get that? Well, 1 ton of methane times 25, which is its global warming potential, comes out to 25 carbon dioxide equivalents, okay? So this gives us then, it puts all the greenhouse gases into equivalent units or into common units to make it easier for pricing and trading and so forth. Now, something actually I've come across fairly recently, actually very recently. And maybe Dr. Sohngen and Mehmood may be more familiar with this program, but it's a relatively new program. It's called the Family Forest Carbon Program, right? Now, certainly there are obstacles to overcome for small woodlot owners. Those obstacles include the upfront cost to establish a project, the possible amount of land needed to qualify, and the time period commitments into the future. So very recently, a partnership with the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy have created a program called Family Forest Carbon Program, okay, that joins together the various companies and an aggregation of landowners. Now, they do use the Verified Carbon Standard Registry as the registry for this program, all right? So they help, this better enables small woodlot owners to enter into this market. Now, it's relatively new, and I'm not as familiar with it yet. I still need to do more reading on this. But one of the things in looking at how this program could potentially benefit small woodlot owners, okay? This is information that I pulled off of the Family Forest Carbon Program website, okay? And looking at, how they might be able to better facilitate small woodland owners to get involved in this program, all right? Now, probably one of the things that is important here is that, contract length, right? Landowners must commit to, in looking at what normally is an obstacle for small woodlot owners to get into the carbon offset program is the contract length. And landowners often must commit to long-term contract, generally 40 years to more than 100 years, and again, depending on which standard you are using, right? But one of the things that this program enables, landowners' commitment is a more manageable 10 to 20-year contract length. And how they resolve the permanence aspect of these projects. It's addressed at the landscape level through aggregation of many landowners across a region. Okay, so basically, if you enroll in this program, you're not the only landowner in this program. You are one of many others. And so all of that land is aggregated together as part of the project. Okay, so this may be something that, well, it certainly is something I need to explore further, because this one, as I say, I'm not as familiar with it, but it may hold some promise here, because certainly, the cost, which is another obstacle. Many times landowners, typically have to pay the cost to develop, verify, and register the carbon credits, right? But here, their program, they say the program pays the upfront cost to identify and implement carbon-friendly forest management practices that sequester and store carbon. So, two of the big obstacles, cost, length of time, and so forth, they apparently address in this program. I'm sorry I can't give you more information on that, because at least for me, this is relatively new, and I need to get more familiar with it. But I thought I need to bring this to everyone's attention, because I think this certainly is a possible viable way to get into this whole aspect. So, can my woodlot be a solution to climate change? Which now we get back to the original question that we all started off with, right? Well, the answer is yes. And that certainly is true whether you take advantage of carbon markets or not. As I pointed out, your forest, your woodlot is absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere, all right? Now, and it is possible to get paid to help mitigate the climate change, right? That's one of the things that we've been talking about. Now, the woodlot is a solution and not the solution or only solution, right? It's a piece of the overall scheme, the overall puzzle to mitigate climate change. Now, forests are the most efficient and economic means to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, because that's what they do, right? You can't force them to do this, because this is what they naturally do. So it certainly is a very natural method of mitigating climate change, right? Forests provide the most significant pathways among natural climate solutions to addressing climate change. Now, to maximize the potential of forests in this regard, forests must remain as forests, obviously. If a forest isn't no longer a forest, then it can't do what it normally does, which is sequester carbon. So forests must remain as forests, improving the management of existing forests to keep them healthy and growing, and encourage more use of forest products as raw materials. Now, let me just a few final comments about that, about the forest products, all right? Now, certainly harvesting trees from the forest count as leakage in the system. That is, carbon is removed out of the forest system. And on top of that, when you use harvesting and all the associated equipment with harvesting, that also creates additional leakage, because they're in most cases are going to be consuming fossil fuels, emitting, so forth. So in that whole process, even though you are extracting stored carbon out of the forest, you're still emitting carbon in the process. But the carbon sequestered from the atmosphere remains stored in the wood until it is burned or it decays, right? It's there. For those of you who have wooden furniture, your furniture contains atmospheric carbon. It was in the atmosphere at one point in time. And depending on your registry contracts, you may be permitted to harvest wood from your woodlot. Now, I'm not suggesting that harvesting is totally out of the picture. It depends on the standard or the registry that you may work with, and it depends on what the improved forest management is. You still may be permitted to harvest wood from your woodlot. Now, from the standpoint of reducing the carbon footprint, the use of wood as a construction material is more carbon neutral than construction alternatives. So, if you look at what the American Institute of Architects have published on their analysis of this, they have reported that for every ton of wood used in place of potential alternative materials, emissions of 2.1 tons of carbon or 7.7 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, right? You know that term now, are avoided. This includes accounting for carbon emissions during manufacturing of products. So let me just show you what we're talking about here. So when we start looking at the use of wood-based construction materials, when you account for the carbon emitted during its manufacture and the carbon that is stored in the product, more carbon, these wood-based products are more carbon neutral than the non-wood products, okay? So if you look at the emissions, the process emissions, carbon that's emitted in the process of making the product minus the amount of carbon that is stored, right? So all of our, if you look at the listing of the different construction materials, and this is based on kilograms of CO2 per square foot of wall material, all right? We find that many of the wood-based products, right? Now there's a few up here, but you're combining plywood with vinyl and steel framing and so forth. And here is some OSB, with vinyl and steel framing. But if you look, all of the wood-based products there is a negative in terms of the emissions. In other words, it is more carbon stored in the product than what is emitted in its manufacture, okay? So, wood products, obviously, and I think all of you know that, are more carbon neutral than any of the other construction materials. Okay, so I think I've used up probably more time than I needed, but as Kathy has pointed out, Doctors Mehmood and Sohngen are going to be now available for a question and answer period on the subject at hand here. So I appreciate you all sitting there and enduring my conversation. As I mentioned at the outset, I have listened to myself, going back over some of the class Zoom recordings, and man, I really feel for the students. And so I feel for you too.
Oh, Roger.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Kathy.
You can do that however you want. Okay. Thank you. I mean, I think that was a great presentation. A lot of good data for folks, and hopefully helps put some things in perspective as we talk about climate change and carbon and dealing with our woodlands. I did see that Brent answered some of your questions in the Q&A box as we went along. I might pick up on one of those depending on where we end up here, but let's see, Roger. So Sarah asks, I'm seeking to replenish wooded area where we lost a ton of trees over the years due to weather. Any recommendations on species that are best for carbon consumption?
All right. Well, now are we talking about carbon consumption or storage? Right.
I think she means sequestration. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, right. Well, when we start looking at species, there are two things to think about here. It's growth rates of species and the specific gravity or density of species. Okay. Growth rates. And I will say, typically, in general, trees that show faster growth rates tend to be lower on the specific gravity range, okay? Recommending species for absorption of carbon. Well, I would say if you're looking at it, trying to sequester as much carbon as you can in a relatively short period of time, I would lean toward the faster growing species, right? But if you're looking at storage, then I would lean toward species that are more dense, because per volume of tree, they're going to hold more carbon than those that are less dense. Okay.
Okay.
I would also add that you probably should also look into the native species that grows well in that area, on that site, and opt for some of those rather than going for something that might not end up growing well on that site.
Okay. Let's see. Next question. Kathleen asks, what is the overall effect of non-native earthworms on soil biomass? We see a lot of that in the Great Lakes area. I have to say that the non-native earthworm thing comes up in a lot of our discussions, and there's a lot of damage being done, but what do you do about a woods full of non-native invasive earthworms? And so there's no good answer, I guess I would say, to that, but is there an effect on soil biomass, guys?
Well,
silence.
I'm sorry.
Come on, Roger. I'm sure you know this.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, my only real familiarity with earthworms is on the end of a fish hook. So to be honest, I don't know. But I'm thinking if any organism, set aside the invasiveness of it or whatever, any organism that can incorporate, which earthworms do, they incorporate organic material into the soil, that's going to be beneficial. Now, how they are different from native earthworms, I don't know the answer to that. But my only answer to that would be, as long as they're incorporating organic material into the soil, then that's a positive thing. Okay. I will dare say, and restoration folks are going to probably skin me alive when I say this, but even non-native species that are growing in the understory, they are sequestering carbon. They are a carbon pool, right? So from that perspective, if you have an overabundance of non-native species growing, garlic mustard or whatever growing in the forest, I guess the one positive thing about that, is that it's sequestering carbon. And when that material dies, it's putting some of that back into the soil. So not all non-native species are
watch it
bad from a carbon perspective. Now we can talk about how that affects other things, and that's another story.
However, getting carbon credits, though, some programs may have rules against, non-native species replacing native species and things like that. So there are some rules along those lines.
Yeah.
And now we have the whole story. We know that Roger will never be a real forester because he's now an academic completely. He said, I don't have any idea, but I'm going to answer anyways.
But I did say I don't know.
Exactly.
Okay.
Professor Williams.
All right. So, you have to say, if you don't know something, you have to say that.
That's true. You admit what you don't know. That's
Right.
fine, rather than trying to fake it. Yeah.
So I'm going to read a comment that Thomas Jervy just left in the chat. He said, Lumbricus terrestrius, which is our nightcrawler, it's the largest earthworm common in many places. They are European natives. Very true. They differ from most native worms by pulling much surface carbon from the surface deep down. That sounds good, but they reduce surface carbon leaf litter, which is important and supports many parts of the native ecosystem. So the net effect is very complicated. And yes, good comment. We had a talk on non-native earthworms recently for a Woodland Water and Wildlife Conference, and Tara Ball from Wisconsin spoke. She didn't really talk much about the impact on soils, but what she did say is, this is a relatively new area. People are just starting to study the impact of these non-native earthworms, which are in all of our essentially soils right now. So it's again going back to nobody really knows, I think, at this point in time, but maybe in the future we will.
Okay, so Molly asks, how do factors such as urbanization impact stocks and pools? Are these impacts accounted for in management? All three of you are quiet. Come on.
Well,
So
it
one thing-
obviously affects stocks and pools and because of removals and things like that. But whether it's factored in management, that's a more complicated question because it goes back to who owns most of the forests. They're all private properties, and private woodland owners have the right to do whatever with their land, within the law. So as far as whether or not it's being taken into consideration in management, well, I suppose in a larger sense, in terms of policy, and whether at a state level or a federal level, we do take, there are some considerations of those, but as far as how much we can actually enforce on the ground, it's a much more complicated issue than that. So usually we try to achieve those through programs, through incentive programs or other programs and things like that, because private landowners have, certain rights that are actually enshrined in the Constitution. So, we can't, there are limits to how far the government can go to regulate those.
One other thought on that is that in the Midwest, in Ohio and other parts of the Midwest, suburbanization actually increases carbon sequestration. So most suburbanization occurs on agricultural land. And what happens is trees grow around that after the houses come in. Obviously, lots of people like green grass, but actually there's a lot of trees out there if you look around many suburban places after 20 or 30 years. So what we know is that in the Midwest, suburbanization actually increases carbon sequestration and has increased our sequestration rates. Now in the Eastern US, where we have a longer established forest cover, and where suburbanization means, sometimes cutting down of some trees to put a house in a forested lot, there is a loss of carbon. Of course, the net with the house is not exactly negative, but in any event, there are kind of two different things depending on where you live. And then in the Western US, it's even more of a crazy thing because you have wildfire components there, which really affect the management of forests because, anybody who has a house that's close to a forest in the West has to cut down trees in order to keep their sort of fire safe distance from the actual trees that might burn their house down. So there are, as Sayeed said, there's a lot of nuances here, but just in the Midwest, it's actually good for carbon sequestration in the long run.
Okay. Marquetta says, is red oak similar to white oak in amount sequestered?
Yes. I don't recall the specific gravity information, but they're very similar, okay, in their wood density. White oak tends to grow a little slower than red oak, but in terms of the amount of stored carbon, it's going to be very similar.
Right.
Okay, good.
Yeah, the growth would be faster in case of red oak. So in terms of how fast they would sequester carbon, that will have some effect. But in terms of wood specific gravity, they're similar.
Okay. Rose asked, I heard recently that dying trees transfer carbon to younger trees. Is that factored into this data or relevant at all?
If it's, all right, is it factored into this data? I don't know. There's another one. I don't know if it's factored into this data. It might be indirectly in the sense that if a dying tree transfers carbon. Yeah, and I just read that report not too long ago about how trees communicate with each other through the root system. That was very interesting. How they help support each other. Well, if I would say it probably is, but not on purpose, because if there is a transfer of carbon from a dying tree to a younger tree, the only way they would know that is if they actually measured the carbon in both of those, and that's what has been done, right? And so that data has been presented. How, what's the source of all the carbon in a younger tree? Well, assuming most of it's through photosynthesis, but some of it may be through the root transfer. And so it would have been measured, but not necessarily that specific avenue, but it would have been measured in terms of the results of that. So yeah, I guess it would be. But yeah, I read that report where there is this communication between trees and how one can give another one some additional nutrients if it needs some assistance and so forth. That's something I just read just not too long ago. So that was a little something new for me. So, yeah, even at my age, I can still learn things.
And Brent's going to stay quiet on that one.
Yeah.
Julie asked,
long.
Julie asks, has the emerald ash borer and other tree killing pests contributed to most of the increased deadfall in recent years? And we had a couple of emerald ash borer related questions, one of which I think Brent had a really good answer to, because we're dealing with a lot of woodland owners that have a lot of standing dead ash. And if you're like my woods, the forest floor is littered with dead ash that comes down in every wind event that we have. And so the impact there, it does make you wonder as you listen to the deadwood and
well, yeah, I imagine, if you see the increase in the deadwood carbon pools here in Ohio, I'm sure the ash have contributed quite a bit to that. When you see how much of an increase that has occurred over the past decade, I'm sure a lot of that is a result of the emerald ash borer. Yeah.
I don't know, Brent, I was going to try to pull up your answer because I thought that was.
Well, that was just, we'd estimated around 245 cubic meters that's per hectare, actually. So I'd have to cut that in half and another 50% or something like that to get down to per acre. But, so that's 10 to 15% of the stock could have been lost due to, that's kind of on average across the state, could have been lost to emerald ash borer in the last 20 years. So that's a lot of dead stuff, either still standing or laying around.
Yeah, there's a lot of it laying around, and that's probably one of the biggest questions I get anymore is from woodland owners that have a woods that is heavily, infested. And, what do I do kind of questions? How do I help the forest recover? Those are all things that, they want answers for, and there's no easy answer. Each forest is going to be incredibly different.
But remember, stuff is growing underneath that. So what's interesting is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the carbon, that slows down carbon accumulation in forests. In fact, actually, because I think decomposition rates estimated in Ohio that I've read, we don't have any estimates from Ohio, but around the Midwest are, really around 4 to 4.5% per year. So we're not actually losing that carbon very rapidly, and something replacing that tree, as long as it can pass all those invasive species, right, is actually growing faster than that. So it will actually suck carbon out of the air, even if that dead stuff is laying there, decomposing. So that's not it doesn't mean it's worse carbon wise. It certainly has different effects in the forest biologically, but
In my case, it's multiflora rose and autumn olive. So no, not necessarily good things, but yes, they are, as Roger said.
well, there was a good study in PNAS about a year ago from the Forest Service, Grant Domke and others, that talked about, and there's been a lot of discussion of why we have so many understocked forests in the US. So something like a third of our forests, especially in the eastern US, are understocked, according to the Forest Service with their FAA plots. And, you know, they do think some of it's due to deer browse and stuff like that, but a big chunk of it they think is due to all these invasive species that prevent regeneration, especially when things like the emerald ash borer. So it's not when people harvest it that it causes the problem, but it's when there's a natural disturbance that occurs that then, because of the invasive species, it's really difficult for the trees to get above that forest cover, right? And so, you know, one of the solutions that they were recommending was that, you know, we really need to go out and treat these places by obviously killing off the invasives, but also replanting, you know, what we want in them, which could be the existing species that was there before, as Sayeed says, or something different. But yeah, it's a big problem. It's a big number of hectares out there, acres that they estimate. I forget what the number, but it seemed like it was a third of the forests in the east are understocked according to the Forest Service definitions.
I think you're right. I read that and I was kind of surprised it was that high, but yeah.
Well,
Laid it out, it made sense.
we looked at Royal Polonia, Princess Tree, whatever, that came into the wildfire area down in Shawnee State Forest. And we found that it was that species was inhibiting a lot of the native tree species from regenerating. So now, some of those native tree species that we're talking about is oak and red maple, which have higher densities, which have higher carbon storing capacities than Royal Polonia, which is a very less dense wood. So what the overall impact would be in terms of the total carbon pool, you know, I'm thinking that would be somewhat of a negative.
I would think so. Okay, so Kurt asks, you had a slide with wetlands. Can an acre of wetland provide the similar benefit as an acre of woodland for carbon pool?
Well, wetlands are complicated. I can jump in there really quick, Roger. Wetlands are complicated in part because they have both methane emissions and carbon uptake. And the methane, because as Roger, you had that slide that showed the greenhouse gas equivalence pretty big. So they're complicated. I don't think they aren't creditable in most offset systems. We know that.
Okay.
Well, they are, wetlands are very large carbon pools, you know, and, you know, if you look in the eastern US, you know, it is a significant pool here in the eastern US, but yeah.
Okay, so Thomas asked, how does carbon offset interact with multiple use management such as timber harvests? You're all three smiling.
Well, I mean, Roger was talking about some of those restrictions and rules of the program. So, you know, it goes back to some of those, you know, the issue of leakage, the issue of permanence and all that, and management, you know, what type of projects are eligible for credits. So, yeah, I mean, definitely there would be, you know, you obviously you have the baseline, and then what you're getting credits for are the additional amount of carbon that you're sequestering over and above the baseline. So you know, that is also important there. So yeah, I mean, it is allowed, but the question is, you know, whether there is whether it's a leakage issue or are you actually, you know, does it have a negative impact on sequestration, depending on how much is removed and so on. So yeah, these programs will have rules dealing with each of these scenarios. Right.
And when you're looking at, there is some harvesting that is permitted under some standards, but it's there are parameters on that, because certainly, you can do, if you can demonstrate that thinning is going to increase the growth and the carbon pools, which it could, right? That would be allowed. Of course, you have to account for any leakage, not only of the carbon that's taken out of the system, but of the harvesting that, the harvesting that's going on and so forth. There's additional leakage there, but you're not really going to be able to, harvest that big, 25 dBH black walnut out there, because, or red oak or whatever, because, that is a huge carbon pool that taking out of the system. That one would be a difficult one to justify.
Okay.
Yes, two thoughts on that. One is that, so if you're currently doing something for biodiversity or whatnot, then most offset systems, voluntary systems would not allow you to then get paid to do a carbon credits because you're already doing it for some other reason.
Right.
Now, that to me, there's two answers to that question, which is, is that the right thing to do? And my personal opinion is that's actually incorrect. And if you look at the National Greenhouse Gas Accounting and you understand what we've done at the national level with, so the current forest system in the US is a 700 million ton sink from the atmosphere. And if you think about that, what the federal government has done is appropriated that in order to use it as an offset against all the greenhouse gas emissions from all the other things we do as a society. And they haven't paid anybody for that. So they also haven't taxed the rest of society, although they have caused us to have, more fuel efficient cars and to use more renewable energy and things like that, maybe pay higher energy prices for a time. So, but on the other hand, it's not that big of a cost to us. So there's potential, a really big asset that landowners have kind of let the government, in a sense, take from them. And so the reality is that the way we treat the stuff you're already doing that's already sequestering carbon is we actually at the federal level treat it as additional carbon, because any annual sequestration net from the atmosphere is additional carbon. So, we're making different decisions at different levels. We're forcing landowners not to take things that they're already doing and treat them as additional, whereas at the federal level, we're taking that and treating it as additional. So this additionality thing is a mess. Congress does have a law. I did notice someone else asked a question about that. The Growing Climate Solutions Act that's running through the Senate right now. It's gotten through the committee. It's not going to fix this problem. If you want this problem fixed, you need to contact your legislature, your federal, whoever your congressperson is, whoever your senate. Well, we got 2 senators in the state or any other state. Contact them and tell them, this additionality is crazy. I mean, farmers have the same problem. So that it needs to be addressed with legislation, because it's not actually an efficiency thing. It doesn't, and by that I mean, there are ways to handle it that don't affect and cause harm to our ability to sequester carbon. So I'll sort of leave that one at that. I will say to Roger's point on sort of that black walnut, recent carbon offset. So the most recent carbon offset markets have started to push towards a much more practical definition of carbon, which is ton years. So this is a concept that's been around for a long time. It hasn't been used well in the offset market. So, holding a ton in your forest for a year is actually worth something from the perspective of the atmosphere. And some of the most recent folks who are in this market have figured out ways to start compensating landowners for that. So if the price of a ton is $7, or if the price is actually $50 a ton, that's a permanent ton, but you can be paid for just keeping that out of the atmosphere for a year with some of the sort of novel things that people are doing in the offset market now. So, to Roger's point, if you're going to cut down that tree and you agree to just hold on to it for another year, that's worth something from the atmosphere. And now that people are figuring out how to pay you for that. It's not perfect yet. No one's got to the right solution that really gets this out to everybody, but it's starting to happen. And I think within a decade, we'll see, if if we're still worried about climate change in a decade, which I suspect we will, I think we'll see, you know, really innovative contracts that landowners can participate in that don't tie them down for centuries, but tie them down just for a year at a time.
Good. Let's see, next up, Rita asked, do you have a reference that municipalities might use to value and potentially take credit for carbon credits for public woodlands? For example, my municipality manages approximately 400 acres of natural lands, mostly parks, of which 75% is woodland. It would be great to educate the public about the carbon offset value of these lands.
Yeah, that's another one where you can't, because of these additionality rules, it's really hard to get credit for that. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of the way these markets are structured now. And you know, I think it has to change, but it's going to be a while till we can push that through. If you look, so here's another example of why it's going to be difficult to change. There was a Bloomberg article on the Nature Conservancy about 2 or 3 or 4 weeks ago, a month ago maybe. And it basically took Nature Conservancy to task, because you've always been able to go on to Nature Conservancy's website and buy carbon credits from them. So you can just buy, if you wanted to offset some of your, you know, activities yourself, you could just go buy these things for $5 a ton or something like that. Well, you know, Bloomberg and some other environmental groups have said, you know, what are you doing? You were going to make those protective efforts even without that money. How can you then sell those credits, right? Because that's what the Nature Conservancy does. The reason they do that is to protect lands, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, this additionality is an issue. So the Nature Conservancy is facing this additionality question. So I think parks and other kinds of, you know, places like that would also face those same additionality questions if they tried to obtain credits for, you know, some of those actions.
Okay.
I would just add that if your goal is just to educate people, you can always, you know, have information about how much carbon is stored in these forests, you know, and those kinds of information. But in terms of credit, yes, that's an issue.
Okay. Thomas asks, it sounds like my lifelong commitment to biodiversity and ecologically sensitive approach to the care of my land actually hurts me economically in terms of being able to qualify for carbon sequestration programs. Is that not true?
You know what, Thomas, I wouldn't worry about it. I think Sayeed just said the answer. If you like doing it, do it. Because, and then you look at Roger's pictures that he showed at $7 a ton, you're not going to make that much money anyways in the carbon market right now. You know, maybe in a decade you will, and maybe by then we'll have some of these additionality problems worked out as well, so that you would then be able to credit. So have some hope for the future, but right now it's probably not worth it anyways.
Anonymous asks, we're seeing rapid growth of red maple in our once oak dominated forest. How does red maple compare to oak in terms of carbon sequestration?
Well, red maple actually is a little faster growing than the oak. The density is a little lower than oak, the red maple, but I think, you know, the red maple would sequester carbon faster. It would store just about as much that an oak would store. All right. And it being a shade tolerant species, it's probably going to survive in the forest over a longer period of time than the oak would, because of the competition and so forth. So, well, if in a forest situation, if I had those two species and I wasn't going to do any management to favor one over the other, then I would be pulling for the red maple in terms of the carbon, you know, if I'm looking at it from a carbon perspective.
Okay.
You're making enemies, Roger.
No, because if he's going to grow all those red maples, Sayeed will just tap them and make syrup on top of it.
That's what I was gonna say.
Daniel asked, can you speak to future projections of carbon credit values in both voluntary and compliance markets as it relates to supply and demand changes?
Yeah. Well, the price right now is really is coming up a lot. Actually, we've seen it in the compliance markets in California, New Zealand, other places where they have compliance markets that allow offsets. They've risen, 15 to 20% in the last year, expected to continue increasing in those places. Voluntary credits haven't bumped up yet, and they've stayed relatively modest. But you know what? There's an enormous amount of action in the voluntary credit market right now, and there's a lot of pricing going on that most of us aren't seeing. So last week, one of the folks who's done a big sort of market offset in the southern U.S. and forests, where they something like 10 million acres went into contract for extending rotations on southern pine lands, was suggesting that they got $10 or $17 a ton, which it's a voluntary market, so it's not a compliance market. So that would put the price of carbon in league with the compliance markets. So, we're just seeing data now. As people compile this data over time, we'll see more and understand what's happening there. But it looks like prices are ticking up at the federal level. The Biden administration has said that the federal regulations are going to target $51 a ton for benefit cost analysis, and so that would be kind of an upper cap of the price in the near term. So I expect them to continue rising.
Okay. Shelby asked, can you guys speak to greenwashing, quotes, or the concern that companies will use carbon offset program participation to improve their image without making many other strides to improve their practices in other ways?
Well, yeah, you can't. So I think all we can do is make sure that the carbon credits are measurable in the forest. As I've said, I don't agree with the additionality concerns. A lot of people do those, so we can try to do things on the additionality side. The leakage side, there's nothing we can do about it, but we can at least measure it and account for it. So we just do the best job we can on the land side and make sure that we get that right. And the companies need to be held account separately on that. And I think things like the social accounting, sustainability, so whatever they are, all these sustainability boards that do this are doing a better job of that. So, but that's a great question. We can't control what other companies do in their own factories, but we should make sure that this is as valid as it can be.
Yeah, this has been one of the criticisms of this whole carbon market thing, right? Is that developing these credits as a result of offsets, and then companies can just buy these. It's sort of, the criticism has been is that while they might pay to purchase the credit, and that sort of acts as somewhat of a penalty, it still doesn't necessarily encourage them to do more to emit less, right? If they can emit, people will argue that this whole system just basically enables emitters to continue to emit. They'll just go buy credits. So, yeah, and as Brent said, we just these companies just have to be held to accountability. We know what we can do on the offset side. We know what we can do in terms of getting the carbon out of the atmosphere, and we know that this works very well, and we can do that. But now on the demand side, people. It's a problem.
Yeah, similar acquisitions were, there for other programs like certification, for example. And truth be told, companies, if they have opportunities to use something for their PR efforts, they will, because it's to their advantage to do so. But as both Roger and Brent pointed out, all really we can do as far as carbon sequestration is concerned, we have these programs as tight as possible, as accountable as possible, and I mean, we are starting to see some pressure on companies. In fact, even there, some of the companies, their board of directors are putting pressures on their CEOs and to do more for climate change and so on. So, I mean, in the long run, behaviors will likely change, but how quickly, that's an open question.
Okay, one last question. Who do we contact to start this process with our woods?
Who to contact, right?
Kathy.
Where did that? Oh, Brent.
I was going to say Roger, but anyway, that'll work.
Yeah, contact
long as
Roger.
it's-
Roger already said
Better.
he's not a forester anymore anyways. It's just an academic.
okay, yeah.
Kathy actually, she actually goes out there and does things. So
I'm not buying that. I mean, so you had that list of the various
Registries.
registries.
Right.
I think
And I know
also-
we have at least one or two consulting foresters in the state that do carbon, but I don't know about all of our consultants.
Well, there is that, I didn't have the website up on but there is also, I just thought it was interesting that cooperation between the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. Like I said, I just recently found out about that. That certainly, I need to look at that a little bit more intensely. I don't know a whole lot about that program, but they've got a lot of information on the website. They may be able to provide some additional answers to questions there, and may be able to provide the guidance as to how to get started on something like this. Because that program is specifically designed for the small woodlot owner.
Okay. All right, guys, we're almost at noon. I see that Marnie and Dave both posted the web link in the chat for the Forest Foundation and for the Family Forest Carbon Program. I'm going to post the link for the continuing education credits.